You're listening to Voices of Customer Experience. I'm your host, Mary Drumond, and on this podcast, we shine the spotlight on individuals who are making a difference in customer experience. We also proudly bring you the very best of customer experience, behavior economics, data analytics, and design. Make sure to subscribe or follow us on social for updates. Voices of Customer Experience is brought to you by Worthix. Discover your worth at worthix.com. Our guest today is Sidney Evans. Sidney is an international expert in branding and communications. He's published numerous articles in publications such as Branding Magazine, Forbes, and Oracle Marketing Cloud. He holds an MBA from the University of Miami. He's a senior columnist and moderator of the C-suite for Branding Magazine, where he has interviewed some of the world's branding leaders. Currently, he's completing final edits on his first book about personal branding, 12 pace-setting steps to build your personal brand. Co-hosting with me today is James Conrad, CCO of Worthix. Thanks for coming on to the show, James, and welcome, Sidney.
Hey, hi guys, how are you?
Thank you so much for being on today. We're really excited to talk to you. Starting off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your career, your background? I know that you have a super interesting background where your life kind of pivoted a couple of times. Can you give us a quick rundown and just tell us about what you do?
I will try to be as brief as possible, and thank you so much for having me. I started in sales for a Fortune 50 company, ended up being a corporate trainer, well-versed in sales and customer experience. In fact, I taught thousands of sales reps how to sell. From that, I pivoted to, believe it or not, I took a break, left corporate, became a voiceover artist, believe it or not. So I learned branding from a different angle. I've recorded, hundreds of commercials. So again, I got to understand what brands really were looking for from that perspective. I actually was the voice of Dodge. I've done ESPN, AT&T. And from that, I decided to go back and get my MBA, really put some meat on the bones around sort of technical knowledge and the ability to help brands really sort of take things to the next level. So I went and got my MBA and came out and decided to start writing just to try to add some value. And I literally just started writing. I got picked up by a number of magazines with the mission of really focusing on what's next. So my whole mantra is what's next. And I really try to help brands figure out sort of what's coming next and how to prepare for that. And so that's a quick synopsis, a very quick synopsis of me.
And what was the thing that inspired you to write about customer experience? Or what is it about customer experience that fascinates you and attracts you the most?
I am obsessively concerned about how things happen. I wouldn't say critical, but I'm observant. And so anytime that I go into any organization, restaurant, I am looking at every detail. How could things be better? Because I firmly understand that there are a lot of small things that add up to big things. And oftentimes brands miss the small things and they balloon into problems later. And so what I've been sort of focused on again is what are the small little things that you can do differently? And so for me, customer experience has been a really big thing for me, especially, and I'm also a foodie. So I go to a lot of restaurants and I see a lot of disconnects with how the restaurant, necessarily portrays themselves online, and then you get inside and there are faux pas or whatever that might be. And so for me, I just think it's a lot of small things that brands can do to ensure that the customer experience is robust.
It's kind of a curse, isn't it? I do the same thing where I can no longer enjoy a single experience because I'm always looking for the angle. No. I'm always looking for either whether they're going to do a really good job and then I can talk about it or write about it, or whether they're going to screw it up and then I can write about it or talk about it.
Very true. I have a great story for you about that later.
Nice. Yeah, it's been really interesting. And Sidney, I came from the brand and advertising world for most of my career, and I've also pivoted to customer experience over the last several years. One of the things that's fascinated me is, thinking about how brands spend all this money to set up these expectations, and then the customers come in and experience and have these expectations when they come into the restaurant or the hotel or the airline. And oftentimes what you experience, as you've mentioned, isn't what you expected based on the TV ad or what you read online. And I've been concerned and question, why aren't brand folks more connected with CX folks in organizations? And I wondered from your perspective and the work that you've done in helping companies around branding, what are your thoughts and what have you seen around the integration of brand and CX? And have you had conversations with brand folks or CMOs about the importance of delivering against all those expectations that we set?
Absolutely. And that is a really great question. And so there's a fundamental problem that I think is happening. And so to your point, brands, put out this imagery on what they would like the customer experience to be. And I really fundamentally believe that the disconnect is around touch points. And so I speak about points in the Oracle article. And the reason that I brought that up is because there are thousands of touch points, right? So if you think about, you're walking into the restaurant, the maitre d' is greeting you. You go to the bathroom, is it clean or dirty? Were you seated properly? Is the waiter, or waitress, given the proper amount of attention? There are so many different touch points that have to be taken into account. And I think that's the misalignment that's happening with brands. It's ironic because I had the opportunity to sit down with David Rockwell from Rockwell Group, which was amazing, world-class architect, and spent 4 hours with him. And I'm telling you, he is obsessed with the small details. I mean, just even in his office, from serving me green tea to how his office is set up, his sort of integration of staff, speaking to every person, asking, what happened today? Who did you speak to? What, how can we do it better? It really is important that brands learn to ask open-ended questions and understand that we are in the age of the consumer. Now controls the experience.
And do you think it's possible for organizations to control that much of the experience? I mean, how can you even do that? Is that through like really detailed customer journey mapping? What do you think? What is the secret to being able to control so many variables in the customer experience?
Listening. So I think what happens is, and to your point, and I think it's a really great point, can you control it, right? And so consumers are human, right? We're all human. So people don't want perfect. They want to be heard. And I think that if you have a problem, you listen, you correct, you move forward. And the story that I was going to give you, I was just in Spain. I was at the Marriott in Spain, in southern Spain. And we had an interesting experience, I should say. And so I spoke to the general manager. Well, first I went to the front desk and I asked for the general manager. He wasn't there. He immediately scheduled to come meet with me the next day. Immediately, the next day. We sat down and I said, this is not about getting someone in trouble, because that's what happens. We're not punishing people, right? Yeah. These are coaching opportunities. These are opportunities for brands to grow. And when I positioned it that way, he was incredibly open to hearing what I had to say. Well, guess what? I felt better.
Right.
Heard, and so people just want to be heard. So listening is important.
But how about like actually constructing or making sure that nothing in the process fails? Is that even possible?
I'm not sure if you can, say nothing in the process will fail. That's for sure. But what you can do is set up metrics to mitigate failure, right? And so if you set up metrics in journey mapping, sort of analyzation tools to understand feedback loops, right? And so, I mean, I can't tell you how many brands I speak to that have no idea what a feedback loop is. They have no idea how to construct one. And by the way, there are simple feedback loops and they're more sort of complex feedback. I'm talking about just basic questions. What do you like about the product or service? Does it offer value? What's the alternative that you might use and why would you use that alternative versus our product or service? These are basic questions, but not only do you have to ask the questions, you have to capture the data and analyze the data. So that's the best way to mitigate.
Now, it's a really interesting point, your experience at the Marriott. We've also been talking in the podcast over the past weeks and months about these feedback loops. And I wonder sometimes about the danger of providing an avenue to give feedback and then whether the organization acts or doesn't to change what's happened. So if you think about the experience you had at the Marriott, you sat down with the general manager. What if the next time you went there, you had a similar experience? How would that make you feel? And how can companies ensure that if they're going to have these mechanisms in place, that the information gets to the right people to ensure that they take action, that they don't end up. I always feel the worst thing that can happen is we give feedback and then we experience the same things that we had an issue with and nothing's really changed.
Great point. And so I always say feedback is an aggregate.
Okay.
It's an aggregate. And so you're going to get, this is just, the nature of the internet, right? And the democratization of information. You're going to get, some people are just want to complain. What I always say is that the person that gives constructive feedback, and again, it's a case by case basis, right. But again, it's an aggregate. And so this is where you have to have training. And this is what I spoke to the manager about. It's ironic because I stated to the manager, I said, I know that people often complain. I started with, these are the positive things that happen, right? And so I think that if you have someone who's trained in analyzing the feedback, and again, you look at the aggregate of the feedback, I think it helps you move in a positive direction. To your point, if I came back and the same experience happened, I'd be disappointed, but I would also understand. Again, I have experience in this, but I would also understand it could be a breakdown in training, right? So the brand has to take more responsibility outside of just the feedback, right? So my point is this. So if you have 30 people giving feedback and 10 are around the same issue, not the exact same issue, but in the same zone, right? So the outside dining experience was off, right? Yeah. And that's what happened in particular area. Then we know that we can correct some things in the outside dining experience, right? And so, again, it's the aggregate of the feedback. So it's specific feedback, but it's also the aggregate. That's helpful.
You mentioned in the article that you wrote for Oracle, you talked about how at times companies cherry pick feedback. Mm-hmm. And talk to me a little bit about the dangers of doing this and what are some of the consequences that can be generated for brands that they decide to, eschew perhaps the feedback that doesn't fall into whatever their strategic planning is and just keep the ones that kind of go along with it.
2 points here. Great question. It's authenticity, credibility. Is everyone saying great stuff about us all the time? Absolutely not.
Right.
So how would that be authentic or credible, right? And so the whole notion that, a brand would, and by the way, I have this term when I say savvy brands. Savvy brands understand it's the aggregate, right? Maybe, brands that are, I don't say newer because new is not necessarily a determinant of what a brand does, because there are some newer brands that are doing things right from the start. But it is vitally important. And from my perspective, when I go online, just as a consumer, take away Sidney branding, just as a consumer, when I go online and see that a brand has had and I wouldn't call it a negative experience. That's why I said to the Mary, the GM, it's a coaching opportunity. That's what I used to always say. It's an opportunity to coach. I had an issue at Starbucks in Miami. It's an opportunity to coach. Listen, when something happens, brands have to understand that things always happen, good and bad. But you have to learn and you have to coach. This is your chance to coach your staff to increase the experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Voices of Customer Experience is brought to you by Worthix. If you're interested in customer experience, behavior economics, or data science, follow Worthix on social media or subscribe to our blog for the best content on the web.
So you've talked about training and coaching. I love this angle. We haven't talked a lot about it in previous podcasts, but what have you seen as some best practices of the information flow from collecting the feedback, whether it's through the insights team or research, and getting that to the right people to then develop and feed that into training programs? What have you seen in your travels, Sidney, of some things that you think are real best practices?
Well, I think the first thing is having the right people to analyze the feedback. And so part of what, my experience in a few establishments is that you're oftentimes speaking to someone who is not, number one, trained or equipped to even deal with the feedback. So to give you an example of that, they just go, oh, well, I hope things are better next time. Or,
yeah,
well, I'm sorry you had a bad experience. That's not an answer, right? That's not a solution, right? And in fact, it feels like a brush off. And so it's first and foremost having the right people to analyze and look at that feedback. I think is key. I think two, it's having metrics in place. So I would always say savvy brands are proactive, not reactive. And so I think it's about also, first of all, what are our values? What do we want to be known for? And how do we execute those values across all channels, right? Even across customer experience. So do we want to be known like Zappos? Like Zappos sends, if Zappos hears a baby crying in the background, they send a baby blanket, right? Some employees have been known to do that, right? That's Zappos sort of, that's their model. That's not going to work for everybody, right?
Right.
It's going to work for every brand. So brands have to figure out the metrics that work for them when they get the feedback, because this is the danger, right? The danger is you now have all this data. By the way, data is your biggest strategic advantage at this point, right? But to have all that data and not be able to analyze, use it, and have the right people sort of executing is your biggest detriment. Right. So it's worse to have data and not be able to analyze, use it.
Mm-hmm. That leads me to my next question, which is let's say you have a really good program to collect feedback. Once you have all that feedback, what do you do with it? How do you use it properly? How do you use it correctly? How do you make sure that data will go into improving the process and improving the experience, and not just some feedback loop where it's a person apologizing for the poor service, or, saying, oh, so sorry that happened to you, we'll do better next time, right?
Right. So I think that's a good point. And I think that implementation is key. And so I think that really, really savvy brands, like I spoke with Emily Cup from PEDS, CMO of PEDS. She's a great mechanism for. She always said, you have to hire right first. So having the right people, like I said. But two, I think, and I wrote an article for Branding Magazine at the beginning of the year on the dominant branding trends, and I think artificial intelligence is going to come into play here. I think having the right technical sort of back end is going to come into play here. So the human factor, it's important, but I also think that you're going to get so much feedback at this point. You're going to have to utilize maybe, AI or other technical things to aggregate that feedback and to say, hey, listen, give example. So if you get 100 feedback items, right? Have some mechanism or some, data program to sort of pull the ones that you think will have the best benefit for your company to be able to analyze that, right? Because the thing is that you want to analyze as best as you can to get from the aggregate of the feedback in order to help you move forward as a brand. So I think there's going to be a technical component there that'll help as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. One of the challenges that I've been hearing lately is there isn't a shortage of feedback. There's lots of feedback. The challenge is, how do we sift through all this feedback and not only have a way of understanding and aggregating, as you said, Sidney, what people are saying, but also what's really important, what matters versus just the volume that we get. Maybe a lot of people complain about the menu, but actually what really matters is how the waiter or waitress treats them in the restaurant, for example. So it's finding ways to really understand what matters and what really impacts whether they're going to come back or they're going to, say nice things about us in the future.
Decide to buy in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's such a great point, right? Because again, and this is another point I wanted to bring up. So you could actually, and brands should understand this as well. It's not a zero sum game, right? So if I go and let's use the restaurant example because I like that example. Yeah. So if I go into a restaurant and the maitre d' is really busy and doesn't greet me properly, I'm talking about, we're not talking about Dennys, right? We're talking nothing against Dennys, nothing against Dennys, by the way. But if I go into a 5-star restaurant or whatever, Ritz-Carlton or something, and I'm not greeted properly, or I feel, you still have an opportunity, that chance to correct it, right? It's not, listen, will I remember that? Of course, but you still have an opportunity to correct that. So I think also, too, it's empowering employees. Ritz-Carlton, it's funny, ironic I say Ritz-Carlton, they have an amazing, I'm actually speaking at the Ritz-Carlton in Cairo in December. They have an amazing program where they empower, and I'm sure you guys know this, they empower their employees. I can't remember what the dollar amount is, to correct stuff on the fly.
Right. They give them a budget, right, that they can use per day now.
Yeah, I can't remember what the numbers, but they have a budget.
$2,000 or something?
Yeah, something crazy, right? Again, every brand can't do that. But guess what you can do? You can empower your manager at the restaurant to say, hey, let me send you a glass of wine, because the way you were greeted was not, proper this time. That's a front of the house manager's, role actually at a restaurant, especially if you're spending, 50 or $60, an entree. So in my opinion.
Well, if you take it to the other extreme, if you go to Dennys, for instance, Dennys also has no shortage of customers, even though
Absolutely.
they're not providing a $60 per entree experience. So what is it that Dennys offering that's still somehow worth it to their consumers? So they found a way to complement it in some other fashion. So either by making it more on like price point, having a better price point to that sense, or somehow making people feel at home, like they're having breakfast in their home. They have got their drivers that somehow manage to keep the customers flowing as well. So maybe at the Ritz-Carlton, if maybe, you weren't greeted properly on the entry, there could still be some way to maybe add quality or add an experience. Like you said, send a glass of wine, have the guy on the piano play a special song, anything that might outweigh the bad experience somehow, right?
And to your point, it's not just price elasticity, right? Because some would argue, well, Denny's is $10. That's not. No. That's not what it is. Because if that's your standard, then why is Chick-fil-A doing so well, right? Versus some of these other.
Absolutely.
I went to school in Florida. I mean, Chick-fil-A is a machine. Well, I know one of the owners of Chick-fil-A in Orlando. This guy, I mean, man, oh man, is he like, he is one of the models of customer experience, in my opinion, because, to Emily Culp's point, CMO Kids, you have to hire the right people.
Yeah.
His training of and by the way, this is what I always say, right? As a former corporate trainer, this is my little pet peeve. How much does it really cost to train people, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely less than having to deal with the outcome of bad service.
Exactly. It's like you deal with, so you train them wrong on the front end. And by the way, I train for a Fortune. There's metrics to check training. We gave scripts out to check what people are saying, help them, coach them, move them forward. Don't say it that way. That's not, we want to open it. But my point is this, like, how much does it cost you for one mistake for bad training? That's a question.
Right.
Rhetorical question. How much does it cost you? A lot. So great point.
Wrapping up, because we're out of time, what would you say, like if you were to sit down with someone helping them plan their strategy or how to improve their brand or their customer experience, what would you say are some of the things that we could improve starting now in voice of customer and in retaining feedback?
So what are some of the things that brands can do now?
Mm-hmm. Like first step, how to improve your voice of customer feedback cycle. What's the first thing that you can do?
I think the first thing you should do is take an account of where it is now.
Okay.
Do you have anything in place to even capture feedback effectively? The second thing, and I'm going to throw this in from a branding perspective, and I know we didn't speak a lot about sort of straight branding, but really go back to what your value proposition is. I know it sounds so basic. I know it sounds so generic, but it is like I literally challenge every brand to go back and fully understand your value proposition, your vision, and your mission.
And whether it's updated or not, right?
Absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm.
Is it updated? Did you start with one thing and has it shifted? Right? Because I see a lot of people, I read, I literally, and I'm kind of a nerd like this way. Like I read vision statements, I read mission statements, and I'm like, that's not what they do now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's not, in my opinion, that's not their vision to me. And so I think that moving forward, it is going to be vitally important. So I did where you are now, what's your value proposition? When the feedback comes in, I think you correct it based on that, right? So you're correcting it based on what you want the consumer to see. It's really about perception. Like, what do we want to be known for, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What do we want to be known for? And so if you don't have a baseline of those two things, I think it's virtually impossible for you to even, it's not impossible to offer a better customer experience, but I think that you're really misaligned with offering the customer experience the proper way.
Absolutely.
No, totally agree. Also, Sidney, you've put a book together recently, and I wanted to hear from you on that. What's got you excited about it? Where can people find it? What have you covered? If you could let our audience know sort of what's happening on that initiative?
I'm not going to disclose a name.
Okay, all right.
It's a book of personal branding, and it's 12 steps to building a powerful personal brand. And I will say this, it has been a labor of love for the last 2 years. And part of my travels was I actually spoke to different people in different parts of the world and actually aggregated stories and put stories in around that. And it really is a guide. So let me just say this. So when I rebranded myself, I had to rebrand myself. And so I give you a toolkit on how to do that, but I do it in 12 steps. The 12 steps, of course, equate to once a month. And I hope that it will be a book that people utilize when they need to rebrand themselves and to give tools and strategies to do so.
That's great. It sounds exciting. When do you think we'll be able to see it?
It's being edited now. And
okay. Great.
I'm hosting Rebels and Rulers Conference in Bucharest in October, and I should have it by the time I get back.
Awesome. Well, we look forward to seeing it.
Great. And if our listeners want to follow you, Sidney, and hear more about what you have to say and maybe even talk to you about it, how can folks reach you?
Yeah, I hope they want to follow. Sidinc, SYDINC on Twitter. Sidney Evans on LinkedIn. I think it's Sidney Evans MBA on LinkedIn. And SYDINC, Sam Young David INC on Twitter is probably the best way.
That's awesome. That's great. Thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure speaking to you today.
Absolutely.
You guys are great, by the way. I love the questions. They were awesome. You got me fired up today.
It was awesome. I could hear you feeling really emphatic about it and feeling really passionate about it. I love that.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Customer Experience. If you'd like to hear more or get a full podcast summary, visit the episode details page or go to blog.worthix.com/podcasts. This episode of Voices of Customer Experience was hosted and produced by Mary Drumond, co-hosted by James Conrad, and edited by Nick Gomez. Blog copy and summary by Emma Waldron.